Video. Today is Thursday, June 20th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about the 2024 presidential election and how swing states in the battleground states have been shifting towards President Biden pretty consistently across a significant number of states that are expected to be some of the closest in this upcoming presidential election. Now, earlier today, I talked to you about a brand new Fox News poll that showed President Biden in the lead for the first time since October of 2023. It was a significant victory, one that led to ultimately the 538 average for the first time of the entirety of this year. For the past 6 months, President Biden has been losing to President Trump on the national average. Now today, on the 538 numbers here, President Biden has finally reclaimed the lead. And while the advantage here is minimal, and I mean the narrowest it could possibly be, it indicates something that is closer to a trend rather than just an anomaly on the national level. This increase in national polling is in conjunction with an increase in statewide polling. And what we're going to be taking a look at today is the race to the WhiteHouse.com trend line over the past couple of months, what the numbers look like specifically over the past 4 months, and what it seems to look like in this election compared to what it might have looked like in February or March. And the reason I find this to be a unique point is because prior to February and March, and around that time frame, was when we were getting into the interesting time frame of the hush money trial, a question about Donald Trump's willingness to serve trial, to speak on his own behalf, to really be in this case where we didn't know what was going to happen. So much was up in the air on the legal side of things that many of us didn't even think that we would be able to get a verdict as soon as we did. And ultimately, of course, we did find out that Donald Trump was found guilty of 34 counts of felonies. It was a very significant thing. It was the first time a former or sitting president in any circumstance, any president of the United States, had had that brought forth onto them and been found guilty of it. And so it was a huge deal. And clearly, we have seen some change on the national level following the conviction. But this trend here, I think, going back to prior to what we saw when it came down to national headlines about the trial here, statewide headlines about the trial, some more recent moves show us that the trend for President Biden is moving in a positive direction. And so Race to the White House has actually compiled a net support list here 4 months ago and today, what they declare to be before and after in their respective columns. And they track the shift over these 4 months on the national level, on the statewide level in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, North Carolina, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And in nearly every state, with the exception of Pennsylvania, including the national average, Joe Biden has made an advantage point. And so I wanted to map that and take a look at the number of electoral votes that shifted towards President Biden versus President Trump and what this could potentially mean for the 2024 presidential election. Now, the numbers here are not significant enough to say that we have seen such a large shift that this has completely changed the way we look at the election. But it does, however, change the way we can look at individual states, which in part makes up a huge chunk of the electorate. When you're looking at states like Arizona and Georgia and Michigan and North Carolina and Nevada and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, different things impact those regions of the country very differently, right? You are talking about certain things that might matter to voters in Arizona that don't matter to voters in Pennsylvania. Things that matter to voters in Georgia that don't matter to voters in North Carolina. They might be close together. There's just different regions of the country that pull in different crowds, that pull in different, issues and candidates and different types of styles of campaigning, whatever it might be. They are fundamentally different. And so it is an always interesting thing to pick up on when there seems to be one consistent trend in favor of one candidate here. And that's what we're going to be exploring. And so on the map here, we're going to be taking a look at the shift across all of these states. Practically all of them, with the exception of Nevada and Wisconsin, have trended towards President Biden. And so you're looking, for instance, the first example is Arizona. Before was Trump plus 4.6. Today, Trump plus 3.2. And of course, that's still an advantage for President Trump, but President Biden may be able to continue the momentum between now and November. What that would mean is that Arizona would be chopped down and down and down and trend towards President Biden. The state of Georgia shifted by 3.4% on the average here. That's quite significant if you ask me. If that continues, a few more months, you'd end up in a position where Joe Biden is within striking distance of winning the state. Michigan went from Trump plus 4 down to Trump by less than a point. That is nearly a 5-point swing. Quite significant, or 3.4% swing, nearly 4-point swing is what I meant to say. In North Carolina, a 2.5% swing, a reduction in support for President Trump. in Nevada, a very, very narrow improvement for Democrats, but arguably something to watch. Because Nevada might be one of those states that actually doesn't shift and then ultimately still ends up voting blue because of the historical overestimation of Republican support. In Wisconsin, a shift by 0.5. And in Minnesota, which isn't up on this screenshot here, but I checked, a shift of 1.7. The only state to shift towards President Trump was the state of Pennsylvania. And at most, his lead is an advantage of just 1.1%. The fourth narrowest race on this entire screen. So here we are. In terms of trending towards Donald Trump, 19 electoral votes, and that comes from Pennsylvania. Trending towards President Biden, 84 electoral votes. These are good metrics for President Biden. The trend line here is significant. You have a huge chunk of this country, 84 electoral votes saying we are moving further and further towards Biden as the news around Trump's conviction is released. As news around Project 2025 is released, as different scandals sort of plague the Trump campaign for a third time around, that suggests that Donald Trump isn't as well positioned as he was a month ago, isn't as well positioned as he was 2 months ago, 3 months ago, evidently 4 months ago. It is always something that to see candidates when they peak early on in an election. Meaning that this point in time may very well be Donald Trump's best performance in this entire election. His polls may be at the highest point today than they may be in November. And even if he does win, if he was to win being down in Wisconsin, down in Michigan in the polls, down in Georgia, down in Arizona, and he wins, what would that say about a map when he was up in all of these states? And he still is, in a way. Some leads are negligible enough that the margin of error puts it within reason that Democrats or Republicans might be able to sway it one way or the other. But ultimately, Donald Trump does have the upper hand in some of these states. But it is the trend lines that I think should worry the Trump campaign. Because it shows that while there may be a whole number of factors that could have impacted the reason why there's trends in favor of Biden since 4 months ago, the point being that in every battleground state with the exception of Pennsylvania, it has shifted towards President Biden. If it was anybody's election and it truly was as competitive, or not even as competitive, as pro-Republican, as, the GOP would like to say, as pro-Trump, that they're going to easily win this election, you would find that the trend lines here would not be consistent across battleground states. Because otherwise, it really just shows that there actually is some merit in what we are seeing here when we talk about a consistent trend line that we've seen over the past couple of months. Now, a lot of this has to be recent too. Donald Trump has been losing support amongst independents after his guilty conviction. Politico talked about it, and I talked about this in my earlier videos today, about the real fallout from the Trump campaign. And Joe Biden is really tacking on to that, breaking through with voters that his campaign had been dying to win over. You can even see it too when it comes down to the independents in this head-to-head matchup in Fox News. They shifted away from being really strong for Donald Trump in the last election, and now in favor of Joe Biden. I mean, you are talking about some voters even who were Trump 2016, Trump 2020, that this time around are now moving towards President Biden. That's important. Favorability rating, that's important. And what we are finding is that Democrats are now tapping back into a very similar strategy and playbook, one that they used in 2020, instilling, all of this concern about the opposing candidate rather than their own. And of course, that's not just the only thing they're doing. It's just what is being perceived by the people in these polls. And it seems to be working effectively because clearly the numbers are changing. These trending Biden states, I think, also aren't going to stop trending towards President Biden, at least not in the way that we think. These states were never going to be, for instance, when you take a look at the screenshot here, Trump plus 7.9 in Georgia. That was never going to happen. In fact, the Republican plus 4.4, I also find a very difficult time to believe, which means it'll probably still continue to narrow up as we get closer and closer to the real election results, which benefits Biden. Because right now, a lackluster response rate when it comes down to the polls, and unwillingness to admit that one is voting for President Biden, even if he is, really shows that, these polls aren't always spot on. They're missing some portions of the Democratic electorate. But shifts can be noticed because the polls from 4 months ago are likely still missing the same chunk of the Democratic electorate that the polls today are matching, which means these numbers are really useful, not necessarily in terms of overall margin, but in terms of trends, in terms of what we were seeing amongst the same exact electorate that 4 months ago was choosing Republicans plus 4.6. That's now Republicans by 3.2, or Republicans by 3.8, now Republicans by 0.4. This is good news for President Biden, and that is really the only way that Democrats can really take this, because it is showing that in every battleground state, with the exception of Pennsylvania, we have seen better numbers for President Biden, better than we have seen in a very long time. And Fox News releasing this new poll here serves to be the first mainstream media outlet to show President Biden with an advantage for the first time in a very long time. I mean, even for Fox News, nearly a year later, does Joe Biden finally reclaim the lead? You are talking 9 months apart, or not 9 months apart, but 7-8 months apart from the last time this poll was conducted. A very, very long time of consistent numbers, consistent data, saying that Trump was going to win. And it is these shifts, it is these changes in swing states that could lead us very well back to a 2020 electoral map, with the exception of just a state or two. President Biden absolutely has the pathway to re-election. And we've talked about it time and time again. How he could go through the Sun Belt, how he could go through the Rust Belt, how different combinations of states like this one, and my most recent election prediction shows Arizona, shows Michigan, shows Pennsylvania as part of the winning coalition for President Biden. But again, should he do well in this debate and capitalize on the conviction and continue these trends to go and go and go, it wouldn't be shocking if Biden won by more than 271 electoral votes. Because if there is anything that we should take away from these changes over the past 4 months, specifically the change on the national level over the past 3 weeks, is that voters are paying more attention and that it's only hurting Donald Trump. People are becoming more acutely aware that this is back to being a two-way race and that their priors in 2020 voted for Biden out of the sheer idea of rejecting Donald Trump. And that could be the winning strategy again for Democrats in 2024. I could see that happening because it worked in 2020. The Trump campaign is also getting quite complacent. I also talked about this in an earlier video today because I think it is becoming a very consistent problem here, where something like this may not even raise alarm bells on the Trump side because they're so caught up in this idea that this election is hands down a Republican victory. And maybe they'll be right. Maybe in less than a year from now, I will be proven entirely wrong. But forgive me when I tell you that I believe it's BS in the idea that this election is a foregone conclusion and that President Biden is not in a chance for victory. Because in fact, I believe he is the most likely candidate to win this election. When I look at the electoral map, the math is there for the National Democratic Party. And clearly so are the trends, whether nationally, which you can see here, or statewide, which you can see here. All of it seems to show that President Biden can very much come back, clench the victory, bring it back home for the Democratic Party, and that would be one of probably the biggest political comebacks we have seen in modern political history. From Trump being up in all of the battleground states, after years of being underestimated as the Republican nominee for president, he could very well be underestimated as the Republican nominee for president yet again. And so I think that may be part of the reason why his team believes he's going to win so heavily. But this is a different election. It's our first presidential election post-Dobbs. It's our first presidential election post the 2022 midterms, where Democrats did far, far, far better than what the polls, the pundits, or anyone had expected. It showed that the polls here don't always skew towards the left. That polls here can be wrong and underestimate the Democratic Party. And it could be doing that again. The trend lines here should worry Republicans, and that is my takeaway from this. That the Trump team should be waking up that this conviction and the past 3 to 4 months of relentlessly hammering in points around President Trump has done damage. Now they need to prevent the bleeding. Now they need to do enough patchwork to ensure that they can reach the Oval Office come January 2025. Because Democrats have a lot of money expected to be spent soon. They have a lot of time, a lot of enthusiasm. They have over 1,000 now on the Biden team, 1,000 organizers across the country. The Trump team has less than a few hundred. It is not even comparable at this point about the robust campaign that we see on the Democratic side versus the Republican side. And that could be contributing to these trends here. Because things like this don't just happen overnight. This has been a consistent thing over 4 months, and almost every state has leaned in one direction, going so far in some as a 3.4% shift over the past 4 months alone. Michigan, based on this trend line, would be next to flip. You see it in Wisconsin as the next to flip. You would see it in states like Arizona would be the next to flip. These states and their trends indicate Democrats have a much higher chance at victory than otherwise suggested. And that's what we see in this overall net support map. 84 electoral votes trending towards Biden, just 19 for Donald Trump. And that matters because it could make or break this election in the same way it did back in 2020. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.